All right. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's PatternFly community meeting. I have posted a link to today's agenda and the slide deck in the chat. And I'm recording this meeting so that I can post the video recording on YouTube. So following this meeting, I will send out all the slides and a link to the recording via the PatternFly mailing list. So if you're not on the mailing list, this is your reminder, get on that. Let's see if I can share my screen. That would be helpful. Let me figure this out. Behaving strange today. All right, you can see something, I think, so that's good. All right, hopefully everyone can see the slides. The agenda is not quite as packed as usual. Hopefully we'll be able to get through everything, no problem. I will kick us off by talking about beta component promotion candidates. So quarterly, the PatternFly team evaluates some of our newer components that we currently label beta and evaluate whether or not they are stable enough, have had enough experimenting or use of them done by products, ironed out some of their use cases, and add them to a list for possible promotion. So the end of this month will be one of those times that we hopefully get to promote a whole bunch of our components out of beta. And really what this means is once we release a component, we've tried to make it meet requirements and be useful. So we definitely love when products evaluate the degree to which we've succeeded in doing that and provide feedback. But when we do that, we usually mark them as beta, which means there's opportunity for evolution of these components and their APIs for a period of time. And once we promote a beta, that means that a component is no longer going to have its API changed unless it's a breaking change release, but those are very infrequent and very loudly advertised. Basically, components that are not beta are very stable. So that's our goal. I'm going to pull up the list right here. There's a handful of components up for promotion at the end of the month. And I'll run through them very quickly and give you a very quick overview just in case any ring any bells or catch your attention. If there's any further adjustments we want to make to any of these components before they get moved out of beta, this would definitely be a great opportunity to raise your hand. Any component can be, delayed in its promotion to the next quarter or in the future if it needs to. So the first one is the action list component, which is basically just a group of actions with set spacing. The drawer component, which has quite a number of variations, including a resizable drawer and an inline drawer used in many of our demos. So definitely let us know if you have any further requests for that component before it's promoted. The inline edit is a component which currently only exists in our core repo. It does not have a React implementation, although it is implemented as within a handful of our React components, but the styles and the CSS and HTML around the inline edit component are what are going to be moving out of beta if it gets promoted. We have our label group, which is relatively self-explanatory. Our number input component, allowing you to increment and decrement numbers. Our skeleton component, which is more like a loading state, or allows you to expose content incrementally. Our composable table is our newer implementation of the React table, and it is it allows you to compose your table using relevant T-head and T-body components, and is a little bit more intuitive if you're very familiar with building HTML tables, in my opinion. So it's been around for a little while, and now it's officially moving, hopefully, out of beta at the end of the month. And we also have an editable row variant of our table component. We have a toggle group, which is sort of a type of radio button kind of single select implementation or control. So that one is going to be up for promotion. We have a few CSS utilities as well, some for modifying background colors, and some for modifying font size and weight and color and wrapping behavior. So these are under the utility section on the website and are designed to be used in many different components, but they've been in beta. So that's the end of the list for this quarter. And like I said, if you have any thoughts or further requests for these components, we'd love to hear about it, so that in case we want to modify their APIs before they're promoted, we know that, and we can maybe postpone their promotion. But we love, committing to stability, so that's one of the reasons we're pushing to get these components promoted. So that is all for that. The other thing I wanted to point our attention to today is the fact that I believe since our last community meeting, we have officially renamed all of the master branches across the PatternFly repos, or the three largest repos, the PatternFly React, PatternFly org, and PatternFly core. I guess it's just PatternFly/PatternFly repos. Their master branch has been renamed to main, so that might impact people who have contributed and have either forked those repos or have cloned them and are using them locally. Just something to keep in mind. If you have any questions about how this might impact your development, please reach out. Our whole development team has adjusted, so look at that. Zack is adding the links to the repos that have changed on the fly. Thank you very much. So those links will be in the slide deck when I email it out. All right. So that is all from me. So I will stop sharing my screen and pass it off to Jessie and Bonnie for an accessibility update.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. So I wanted to share a really cool update that we've made with alerts and alert group. One of the toughest things with accessibility sometimes can be dynamic content, because a lot of times when you're rendering something dynamically on a page or in the DOM, you have to figure out how to notify users of that change, which can be kind of complicated, and there's different APIs between the different screen readers, which can create some difficulty in making sure that something is accessible across all screen readers. And we've kind of noticed this with our alert and alert group. So we've explored a lot of different options in terms of how to make sure this is accessible across all screen readers. There are different types of alerts, which is going to affect the way that we need to handle them. Obviously, you have static alerts. These are things that appear on page load and don't change. Those kind of alerts don't need a lot of accessibility added to it because it's just going to be appearing inside the page. However, when it's dynamic or appears after the page is updated or loaded, we have to kind of have more considerations. So this can be in response to a user action. Let's say you're trying to submit a form and an error comes up, or maybe an asynchronous event that's triggering the application. Each of these things that are going to affect the dynamic alert. And so we've found through research and user testing that the best way to do this across different screen readers is through having a container on the page ahead of time. So I've also added some description for each of these examples, because I've noticed that sometimes it can be kind of confusing to know which alert to use and which use case. So if you look, for example, at the singular dynamic alert group here, we added this little live region. And what this does is essentially we created a container that notifies the screen reader that something's going to change on the page. There's going to be dynamic content rendered inside of that. Because most products seem to dynamically render into the page, we're using this alert group in order to announce that to a screen reader. And so whenever you would add an alert to it, that gets added to the container here. So now, when we've tested this, this actually is announced in JAWS, NVDA, and VoiceOver. So this approach is the best way to kind of communicate this to a screen reader in all cases. So all we have to do whenever we have a dynamic alert is to add it into an alert group. We add the isLiveRegionProp prop to the alert group, and that allows you to conditionally render inside of that alert group with your dynamic alerts. And this alert group should always exist in the DOM on page load so that dynamic alerts can be rendered inside of that alert group, and the screen reader always knows that something's going to happen inside of that alert group. So basically, this was our way of trying to do all the heavy lifting for you. Instead of having you on the product side figure out how to make this accessible across all screen readers and how to dynamically render inside something, we've tried to add this to our alert group so that we can do most of that work for you. You can add additional customizations depending on the type of alert you're doing. For example, maybe something that you're trying to update your user is really, really important and they need to know about this immediately. You should add the ARIA live equals assertive to make sure that it actually interrupts their current task and says something super important is happening. ARIA atomic and ARIA relevant are going to affect what types of information the screen reader reads. So you might want to use those depending on what you want the user to hear. But all of these things allow us to dynamically render our alerts in a really, really easy way so that we're handling most of this for you. But as you can see with this documentation, we've realized that some of these things need to be communicated and be clear. Sometimes it can be really tough to know how to handle some of these more complicated interaction patterns. So we've had a documentation effort in which we are trying to add an accessibility tab to our components. So you see the React HTML design guidelines, it'll be right after that with accessibility. We want to explain a little bit about whatever that component does, really point out the main things that you need to know as a product that you should add or consider, and then any customizations you might want, and have a little prop table in which these are all the props that might affect your accessibility, either things that you can customize or add, etc., to really define your accessibility depending on your use cases. And then any other particular use cases that you might want to know about or anything else that's important to know. So that created the effort of documentation for all of our components. So we've started this effort to fully explain both the complicated components and even some of the simple components. So I tried to start with the more complicated components as we kind of saw with alert group and alert. So we have alerts, an alert group, but then I tried to kind of start breaking it into, after that, going into more alphabetical after we've already looked at some of the more complicated components. So this kind of structures the information in a way to make it as clear as possible to know what you need to add and make it not so confusing. Some of them are really simple, like for example with about modal you might just need to add an alt if you have an image, or making sure that you're adding the context that you need to your about modal. But some of them can be a little more straightforward. For example, accordion already has the accessibility built in. It's most likely you're not going to have to add absolutely anything unless you have particular use cases with ARIA expanded or things like that. But we try to make sure that if you want to customize it, we're allowing you to do that and you can understand how to do that. But most of them, as you can see, will tell you exactly, hey, this is already built in, and it's totally okay. But if you need to know of a specific use case, you might need to be aware of that as well. So for example, you might want to add an input label for a context selector, but we always try to add this table to make it pretty clear of what exactly you'd be adding and how you'd be adding it. Those are some of the components that I have covered in this sprint for documentation. Obviously, we have a lot to go. We have a lot of components, so it'll be a slow effort. But I really want to offer and ask for feedback in terms of which components are confusing to you. If you are using a component in your product and you are finding it a little confusing for accessibility, let me know. I will definitely prioritize that to make sure that we are being clear as possible with all of our components. So we've gotten a good bit done, but still a good bit to go. So definitely want to hear your feedback. And now I want to pass it off to Bonnie so she can go over some of the components that she covered this sprint for documentation. Will be great.
All right, let me share my screen. All right. So some of these components may seem simple, but our documentation covers a lot of common mistakes with even these simple components. So the button, for example, is already pretty accessible on its own, but you have to account for some special cases. If a button only has an icon on it, for example, and no descriptive text, you'll need to give it an ARIA label. And there are also some special cases when you want a button to be focusable while it is disabled, or when a button appears out of context on the tab order. For an avatar, since it's an image, you just need to add an alt prop to give it alternative text so that it is screen reader accessible. And labels are pretty accessible on their own, but you may want to customize them further depending on what you're using them for. For titles, an important note is to use appropriate heading structures to communicate the information architecture for a page, and our documentation for the title goes into detail on this here. The skip to content needs to be linked appropriately with which the documentation for it describes, and it's also referenced in the page component, which uses skip to content. And then the page component here has a lot of considerations to take in, such as what regions you're using and their layout on the page, as well as what other components you're including within it. And lastly, the tree view is already mostly accessible on its own, but the documentation here points out what you'll need to do to make specific variants of it accessible, such as the search or checkbox variants. And this documentation will hopefully help you make your use cases accessible and clear up some of the common accessibility issues we often see. And that's it for the new documentation.
All right, thank you. The next update we've got, so this past month, the PatternFly team also did spend a chunk of it doing a breakaway sprint. So we actually have skipped a release because most of the feature work we've been doing, we paused for the sake of a breakaway sprint. So a lot of these documentation efforts are kind of born out of this opportunity to not focus as much on features for a sprint. We also don't have quite as many React and core updates as we usually would have. But we do have a lot of work that's going to be released soon that did get incorporated into our code bases as a result of the breakaway sprint. So that is a few of the things that are going to get presented now. One of them is from one of our React devs. Katie's going to show what she worked on.
Yes, I am, though it'll be code sharing, so I'm not exactly sure how good the quality is going to be for this one. If I can find VS Code. So what I worked on as part of the breakaway sprint is kind of to make a more reusable kind of helper component for our keyboard handling. So as we've been implementing these various different list components, like our select, our drop down, our menu, our options list, and all the other variants of that type of feature, we've had to kind of implement keyboard handling for each of them. And as we've been doing that, noticing that all of our keyboard handling ended up being very similar, if not the same type of logic. So one of the things we did this breakaway sprint is to kind of refactor out that logic into a reusable component that is renderless, so it won't take up any space on the DOM and the screen, but will give us these kind of helper functions so we don't have to continually re-implement our keyboard handling for these very similar list traversal type of elements. So you can see here that this is a keyboard handler class that gets exported. It has a lot of different props for customizing and tailoring it to each type of component specific, like what the elements are and how do I get the focusable element of whatever I'm focusing on. This component has the benefit of actually doing its own setup and tear down of a key down handler function, as well as figuring out if the event is from the container, whether or not to listen to it or not. And then you can pass your own additional key handling behavior to this component. So some components which had the basic arrow key traversal for a list also had other functionality that they wanted to still kind of cover. You can pass that in here. And as you continue going down, there's some basic enter and space handling that are just very basic use cases, so you just don't have to rewire everything up at the same time, especially if like entered is just acting as a click in the case of a DOM element. And then we have this other function I wrote for handling the arrow key traversal specifically. This was because some of our components, which already had their own keyboard handling, it was much less of a lift to refactor the entire thing versus just having a helper function injected into its own handler. So if I scroll up here slowly, so I don't kill people's eyes, there is a handle arrows function. This is also exported from our helpers. This is actually the meat of the functionality, which handles the arrow keys up, down, left, right. And so you can see that these are just kind of two blocks, arrow up, arrow down, and it's figuring out, of the navigable elements I have, where do I go? Same for left and right. And then it'll actually move the focus. And then this will also actually update the tab index. In some cases, we've been doing a roving tab index. So when you're tabbing through a list, you don't have to tab through the entire list to get to the end. Let's see. Oh, and then we have another small helper function to help that roving tab index. So there's a set tab index, which will basically just, of your list items, set everything to -1, so it's out of the tab order. But then when you update it dynamically, you'll put the active element into the tab order. And in practice, this will mostly be internal for, like you could say, in our menu component. This is how it'll look in our code. It is just a component you plop into the render. It doesn't actually take up any space as it is renderless, like I said. And it has a whole bunch of different customizations to make it tailored to the menu component in this case. So these are all the logic that say, well, I don't want horizontal arrow keys handling if I am from a breadcrumb, because that kind of arrow key traversal is different. We don't want that for breadcrumbs versus an actual menu item, for example. These are also both exported from our helpers. If there's something that's interesting to you and something that might be able to be used in your component, these are definitely something you can actually use. But for the most part, these will probably be used by our own components. I think I covered most of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. You'll probably be seeing updates to components regarding their keyboard handling as they begin implementing these helper functions. All right, next up is me again, because one of the things that I did during the Breakaway Sprint was make some updates to our table documentation. Table is one of our most widely used components. It's a lot of the applications that consume PatternFly are very data heavy and display a lot of their data in tables. So before this update, you can see that the number of examples and variants for table is a very long list. It's an ever-growing list. And since we have 2 implementations of table in the React workspace, we also have table component, and we have table composable documentation, and it's for its associated components. And all of the props for these components are listed at the bottom, but this page is very long. I'm going to hurt your eyes like Katie tried to avoid doing by just starting to scroll down it. So what I tried to do was, actually, the HTML tab for the core implementation of table is also got quite a long subnav to just paint a picture of how much documentation that we have. So in an attempt to organize it a little bit better and make things easier to find and make implementing these components a little bit simpler, I began an effort to reorganize a lot of the examples and API descriptions. We separated the 2 implementations of the React table into 2 separate tabs. The newer one is the composable table. It's found under the React composable tab. The older implementation table, still fully supported, still absolutely something you can use or keep using, is found under React Legacy, just to differentiate it from the composable implementation. A lot of the information, there's a lot of added text to some of these examples to provide more step-by-step instructions on implementing both the table and the composable table implementations. And the API and prop descriptions have been fleshed out quite a bit for a little bit more guidance and direction. For example, our TD component is a composable table component, has types, has props that have all unique types depending on the variant. So some data cells are expandable, some are favoritable, and in order to implement all of those, you have to use uniquely defined types that are also now included in the documentation, as opposed to something you'd have to drill down in the examples to parse out yourself. And one of the updates to the org, to the website, has also included adding links within the documentation, so that if you want to implement, for example, a favoritable cell, you just have to click on the type, and it will jump you right to the definition of that type as well. So hopefully with our documentation linking within itself a little bit better, it gives you more context and helps you find things quicker. And with that, I did not shorten the length of the HTML documentation, but I did try to organize it a little bit more. Oh, I don't even think I have it on this example. Well, I don't have it to show you right now, but you can just imagine that with the next update, with the next release, an update to the HTML table documentation as well will be more organized, and so that'll be hopefully helpful and exciting, and people will be able to get through it even easier than before. So that is one documentation update that is coming with the next release, hopefully next week. And another update is something I'm going to have Zack share next. Hand over sharing to Zack.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Can you see this tab?
Yes.
Yep.
Wonderful. All right. So, yeah, this is just some quality of life improvements for the code editor on patternfly.org. So if you're a developer, I now support TypeScript on the site. So here's a TypeScript example I copy pasted in here, and still works. You can still develop it. And I also added some buttons. Oh yeah, it also uses our own code editor, which is Monaco based instead of the old React Live one that used some other code editor that's not supported anymore. So to go along with the TypeScript, there's two buttons, one to convert your TypeScript to JavaScript while preserving its syntax. This is the only button in the world that I know that does this. So you can click it and boom, it converts your whatever you've typed in here to JavaScript by stripping out the types. And then there's this other button to undo all changes to what was originally there. So in case you don't want to have to refresh the page in order to do that. So what this means for you as a consumer is you can put TypeScript in here now, and TypeScript examples are coming soon. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome, thank you. I think one of the things that this change will also add is some syntax highlighting in the code editing. So as you're playing with the examples and modifying the code, you'll still get syntax highlighting now, which is, in my opinion, very helpful. Thank you, Zack. Okay, and next up, we have an update from Matt on what we are working on in the future. Hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Let me share my screen up. Share a couple of slides here, and Okay. So this is kind of a summary of work in progress, at least major new features or enhancements that we are working on, starting with design. Right now, the design team has started to work on, doing a little bit of future thinking, conceptualization and research on looking at what a next generation of PatternFly might look like. So we don't currently have a specific plan or roadmap of when we'll introduce that, but I think from a design perspective, it's always good to be thinking ahead and thinking about how our look and feel may need to evolve over the next couple of years. So the design team is looking at that. We certainly welcome any input or feedback anybody has about that topic. Feel free to reach out to either myself or Michael Saldonio. We're also working on coming up with revised selected states for tiles and cards. So as I think some of you have encountered with the new focus states that are enforced by the browser, especially with Chrome, they kind of visually overlap with what we were doing with selection with blue borders for a card or catalog view, for example. So we had a couple of people that reported it's confusing. If you deselect a card, it still looks like it's selected because it still has focus. So we're looking at a different visual solution there for our tiles and cards. We'll look for that in the future. We're also working on finalizing designs for a back to top component. That would be something you could place on a long scrolling page at the bottom of the page, which would jump you back to the top of the page without needing to scroll all the way back up. So for a complete look at what we're working on in design, you can always visit our PatternFly design workspace, the link at the bottom. We have a number of things that we're currently working on. The core team is working on, or will soon be working on in terms of new features and enhancements. We've been at ongoing work on refactoring our masthead. We recently introduced a new masthead component, and Matt Melting has been doing a lot of work on that component and really creating a more flexible, responsive solution to the masthead. So look for that to be completely rolled out soon. We are also now working on a secondary horizontal navigation. I can show you what that will look like. So our intent is that this will become over time a replacement for what's currently called tertiary navigation. We had a lot of feedback that what we call tertiary navigation was really too similar to horizontal tabs, and folks were getting confused about when to use one or the other. So this is a new pattern that can be used in situations where you still want sort of the primary vertical navigation, but you want to add a sort of a local navigation at the top of the page. And that's, it's much more integrated with the navigation system as opposed to looking more like tabs on a page. Task drawer is another new feature that we're working on, which is designed to allow you to leverage the notification drawer and to allow you to add a list of ongoing tasks and report on status of tasks within the notification drawer. Being worked on in this current sprint. The progress stepper is a new component that can be used in a page where if you're, it's like a sequence bar. So if you have a sequential task and you want to give the user feedback on where they are in that task, you can use this separate component. So it's kind of similar to a wizard, but would not be married to the whole sort of page layout of a wizard. So you could drop this just in the top of your page to kind of report on where you are in the process. And then we're also working on some updates to the tree view to introduce a variant of the tree view which would be more suitable for these types of scenarios where you've got a lot of content and you want a more compact layout, and showing kind of the hierarchy using the borders of where you are in the tree. So, and then last but not least, we're also working on scaling out our vertical navigation story so we can add more variants of vertical navigation as our new console applications are increasing in density in terms of what we need to integrate in the IA. We found that our current 2-level vertical navigation is not always enough, so this story will start to introduce the possibility of having things like flyouts or drill downs in the vertical navigation. So we'll be working on that over the next couple sprints. So more on that to come. And then finally on the React side, we do have work going on right now to introduce this real-time form field validation. So that will allow us to do things like this, where you could kind of say, for example, if your user is entering a password, you could present criteria and update this. This is using our new helper text component to update in real time as the user types into the field how conditions are being met. So React, Katie Nicole is currently working on a demo that shows how to use this. And other things, an editable label group, which will allow the user to edit contents of a label in place. Adding a couple new features to the blog viewer extension, support dark theme and full screen enhancements. And then finally, the React team is also doing some work to refactor drop-down components to use a more composable approach. If Nicole, you want to say a few words about that, maybe tell me a little bit more about what we're doing there.
Sure. Yeah. So not too long ago, we introduced a menu component, and it's a composable implementation of basically your standard drop-down or any component that has some sort of menu that you can open. And so what we're aiming to do is start refactoring our components that use menus, like our drop-down component, our select component, our application launcher, a few others, refactor them so that they use our menu component under the hood. That's largely to limit the amount of duplicate code that we're writing across all these similar components, and also make sure that the interaction and their experience are consistent since they're all so similar. Right now, since we are implementing things like keyword navigation in each of these components respectively, there is sometimes slight variation in how it's implemented and things like that. So as we refactor, we're hoping to smooth out inconsistencies and make them more easily maintainable down the line by all having the same underlying menu component. And ideally, this will happen very quietly There will not be any API changes to any of the components that I'm talking about, like select, because we don't make API changes to components unless it's a breaking change release, which is very, very, very rare. So we're going to do this all under the hood. And hopefully, if you notice anything, you'll just notice a little bit more consistency and smooth experience using these components. And in the future, it'll happen slowly. So we'll do probably one component at a time as best we can to just remove all the variations of menus across all of our components. So it will take some time before it's all completed, but it will probably be hard to demonstrate in these meetings because it won't hopefully be a noticeable change, only if you really look in our code base. So yeah, that's an ongoing effort.
Great, thanks for explaining that, Nicole. And this is actually links to an epic where you can see, and if you're interested in following this, the specific components that we will be refactoring as we go along. As Nicole pointed out, this will be a kind of a long-term effort that will happen across a number of releases. You can kind of look for those changes. Hopefully, again, they will have zero impact on anything we're doing, but just make the way we develop and roll out these components a lot more robust and efficient. Finally, if you're interested in or tracking any specific issues in terms of where they are in our roadmap, you could always link to our full feature roadmap, which kind of places existing requests on our release schedule. Right now, we're planning out through the end of this year. With that, I guess that covers it. Anybody have any questions? Okay, if not, I'll hand it back to you, Nicole.
All right. That is all the updates that we have today. On the last page, on the last slide, I've included a link to joining the PatternFly mailing list if you're not already on that, and also my contact information if you would like to present or have any questions regarding upcoming community meetings. Please feel free to reach out. And we have a few moments if anybody has any questions for the PatternFly team while most of us are here. Before we sign off, I'll open it up. Okay. Well, you can feel free to reach out anytime to me. I'm on Slack often and easily reachable by email. And I will be sending out the slides and the recording from this meeting shortly. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next month at our next community meeting. Bye.